Chapter 5. Chicago is in flames. Claire wasted little time in being frightened. Her first thought was to see if one or the other of the alley openings might be passable despite the billowing smoke. She got within 30 feet of the thick smoke, only to be driven back. The heat was like that of an oven. I tried to open the door to a building but found it bolted. Smoke was escaping from under the other doors, so I gave up hope of finding safety through them. As the roofs and then the interiors of the surrounding structures were consumed by the flames, a scorching wind swept around the alley. The rain of burning embers grew heavier and more unbearable. Claire retreated, seeking the safest, coolest place, and found herself back at the construction site. I cannot say I actually decided to hide behind the bricks, since I could not hear myself think in the terrible noise. I did not even look at the fire, but hid my face in the dirt and pulled my bundle, which I had retrieved, over my head. For understandable reasons, Claire did not spend much time observing the burning buildings around her, so her description of what happened is limited. It can be reasonably assumed that she was surrounded by a frightening cacophony of sounds: wood igniting and burning wildly, the glass of windows exploding, stairways and ceilings collapsing. When the interior support framing of a building had been eaten through and weakened enough, parts of the exterior brick walls would fall with a ground-rumbling roar. The pile of bricks Claire hid behind shielded her from the severest heat and most of the flying debris. But there is little doubt that she had a great deal of luck on her side as well. For one thing, it's likely that most of the building walls did not collapse to release a wave of fire and heat. Those walls that did give way fell far enough from her so that she was not crushed. Other factors may have contributed to her survival. The buildings that ringed the construction site might have had few windows, thus containing the baking heat of their fires to some extent. Most important, a deadly convection column never established itself in the immediate area, so a blanket of killing heat and fire did not cover her. Exactly how long it took for the buildings to burn is not clear. Claire only says that it took many minutes. It probably took much longer, an hour or more, for the fires to completely gut the structures that lined the alley. During all of this time, I kept my head hidden beneath the bundle and said my prayers. Once the main force of the fire began to lessen, Claire peeked out. What she saw must have astonished her. Sturdy brick structures had been transformed into blackened skeletons whose insides continued to burn brightly. Still, Claire had more immediate concerns. My legs and arms and back were all burnt where my dress caught fire. I put out the fire and made ready to leave, which was not easy as the alleyway openings were blocked with brick and burning wood and smoke. I called for help again and again, and at last a voice called back to me through the smoke. He told me to stand away from there, as a wall of the building might fall on me, and that was all. This made me even more alarmed, but I did not want to stay in the alley alone, so I began climbing. The bricks were still hot, very hot, but I found that if I did not stop moving, my feet were not burnt so bad. Claire scrambled over the smoldering pile of debris and made it to the street. She was by no means safe. Buildings up and down the block were burning and collapsing, punctuated every so often by the explosion of flammable liquids. Abandoned pieces of furniture on the street and sidewalk were fiery torches, while shadowy figures darted through the night seeking a safe escape. Claire made her way along the street with single-minded purpose. Now, she said, sensing the enormity of the task facing her, I had to find my family in all of this. During the night, James Hildreth and his men were hard at work trying to prevent the fire from spreading south. After the first few blasts failed to bring down the structures, Hildreth figured out precisely how much powder was needed. Soon he and his helpers were blasting apart house after house along Harrison Street. By the time they reached the Wabash Avenue Methodist Episcopal Church, They were capable of setting off a powerful charge every 5 minutes. With the houses leveled, local residents grabbed buckets and kept the debris soaked until the threat of fire passed. Hildreth's methods appeared harsh to many people, especially to those who saw their homes blown up while the fire was still blocks away. But there is little doubt that the fire breaks he created halted the southward creep of the fire and saved several blocks of homes from destruction. While the fire was being contained in the south, to the north, another story was unfolding. The width and speed of the fire made it impossible for weary firemen to work in an organized or coordinated way. Besides, they were now beyond exhaustion. 2 nights of firefighting and little rest or food had pushed many to the brink of collapse. Several had to be taken from the area in wagons. One tired fireman sat down on a street corner to catch his breath and promptly fell asleep, despite the roar of the fire around him. At 6 o'clock on Monday morning, the fire had been burning over 9 hours and seemed capable of continuing its march north unless more help could be found. Chicago's mayor, Robert B. Mason, had been up all night receiving reports about the spread of the fire and praying for a miracle. Finally, he gave up hope and sent urgent telegrams to the surrounding cities and towns. "Chicago is in flames," read his message to the mayor of Milwaukee. "Send your whole department to help us." Aid came pouring in from Milwaukee, Cincinnati, Dayton, Louisville, Detroit, Port Huron, Bloomington, Springfield, Janesfield, Allegheny, and Pittsburgh. Some cities sent steamers and ladder wagons. Others sent badly needed hose and fresh firefighters. And many did so at great risk. Milwaukee put 3 steamers and their crews on board a train, leaving that city with only 1 working engine. The sun rose on Monday, and Chicago continued to burn. The fire went largely unchecked because the additional men and equipment took many hours to arrive. After narrowly escaping the flames the night before, Joseph Chamberlain had gone to the North Division to watch the fire there. Just before 7 o'clock, he went back to the West Division. Then a curious-looking crimson ball came up out of the lake, which they said was the sun, but oh, how sickly and insignificant it looked. I had watched the greatest of the world's conflagrations from its beginning, and although the fire was still blazing all over the city with undiminished luster, I could not look at it. I was almost unable to walk with exhaustion and the effects of the long season of excitement, and sought my home for an hour's sleep. Chamberlain went up Madison Street into an area untouched by the fire, and was startled when he met scores of working girls on their way downtown as usual, bearing their lunch baskets as if nothing had happened. They saw the fire and smoke before them, but they could not believe that the city, with their means of livelihood, had been swept away during the night. Because telephones, radios, and televisions did not exist, people in distant portions of Chicago did not know very much about the fire. Many people had seen the bright glow in the distance, but the true degree of disaster was not known until burned-out friends and relatives began knocking on their doors. Then, telegraph lines hummed with brief accounts of the tragedy, and these details were passed from city to city. Fuller accounts would follow. Before the end of Monday, the Chicago Evening Journal managed to get a 1-page edition onto the streets. In searing headlines, it announced, "The great calamity of the age. Chicago in ashes. Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property destroyed. The South, the North, and a portion of the West divisions of the city in ruins. All the hotels, banks, public buildings, newspaper offices, and great business blocks swept away. The conflagration still in progress. Fury of the flames. Details, etc., etc." Alexander Freer probably wished he could turn his back on the fire and find a cozy bed. Unfortunately, his adventures with the fire were far from over. After fleeing across the burning bridge, Freer went directly to where his sister-in-law's house had been, his heart filled with grief. He had long ago decided that her 3 children had perished in the fire. Now, on top of this, he had lost track of his sister-in-law, Mr. Wood, and another nephew in the chaos of the night. He presumed the worst. He must have been pleasantly shocked, not just to discover the house intact, but to be greeted at the door by his nephew and Mr. Wood. What's more, they informed me that Mrs. Freer had been taken to a private house in Huron Street and was perfectly safe and well cared for. At this point, Freer gave in to his physical exhaustion. I was wet and scorched and bedraggled. My clothes were burnt full of holes on my arms and shoulders and back. I fell down in the hallway and went to sleep. Less than a half hour later, Freer was shaken awake and told that Mrs. Freer must be moved again. Mr. Wood knew exactly where she was on Huron Street and volunteered to lead Freer there. They went as quickly as possible up Des Plaines Street. For most of the way, houses blocked their view of the burnt and burning section of the city, but when they neared a bridge crossing to the North Division, the view opened up before them. It was about 8:30 o'clock, Freer recalled. We could see across the river at the cross streets that where yesterday was a populous city was now a mass of smoking ruins. All the way around we encountered thousands of people, but the excitement had given way to a terrible grief and desolation. For the first time since the start of the fire, the light of day allowed everyone to see and feel the true extent of damage. Alfred Sewell noted the stunned emotions of the vast majority of citizens. Oh, what a horrible scene was presented to the view of the spectator on that gloomy morning. Heaps of ruins, and here and there a standing wall, as far as the eye could reach, and far beyond for a stretch of 4 miles. We walked through the streets, covered everywhere with heaps of debris and parts of walls, and could not help comparing ourselves to ghosts wandering through a vast graveyard. Am I really awake? Or am I having a horrible dream? Is a question we seriously asked ourselves many times. People were stunned and overwhelmed, and probably feared the worst about relatives and friends who might have been in the path of the Great Fire. But Freer had to push aside his emotions and exhaustion. His sister-in-law was still somewhere near the burning fire, and he had to act if she was to be saved. Luckily, Wood knew where to find Mrs. Freer, and we arrived at the house just in time to get her into a baker's wagon, which Wood and I pulled for a half a mile. His sister-in-law was still distraught over the loss of her children, and grew even more agitated when they passed a wagon loaded with frightened children. Freer and Wood hurried away as quickly as possible, weaving around the piles of personal property abandoned in the road. Once back at his sister-in-law's home, Freer tried to make her comfortable, aided by the capable hands and kind words of neighbors. The shock of his experiences began to set in, and he was overtaken by a pounding headache and fever. He had run the gauntlet of flames, risked his life several times in a futile effort to locate his young nieces and nephew, and barely managed to escape. Imagine his feelings when, at 4 p.m, the solemn, sad whispers in the house were replaced by loud, joyous shouts. A second later, Freer discovered that word came from the Kimballs that the children were all safe out at Riverside. It was then that Freer could drag himself to a bedroom, climb into a bed, and pull a quilt over his head to shut out the fire. As Freer slept, the fire went north with little opposition. House after house ignited and burned to the ground, leaving behind blackened foundations and charred heaps of wood. This area contained some of the city's largest, most stately homes, but the fire treated them with the same disdain it did the humblest wooden cottages on DeCoven Street. With the water supply gone, firemen could do very little unless they were near the river or lake and could draw water directly from those sources. Not even Hildreth's special talent with powder prevailed. After creating an effective fire break in the south, Hildreth took his powder and scooted north to get in front of the fire. He took with him only 2 helpers, assuming that residents of the threatened blocks would eagerly volunteer. He tried to stop a number of men hurrying to escape, but none responded. I grabbed hold of them, took right hold of them with more force than if I'd been sheriff. But they would leave me, just as soon as I would take my hands off them and cut. The word powder was a terror to them. Finally, Hildreth, frustrated and weary, admitted defeat and headed home. The same chaos and flight took hold of the northern section of the city. Alfred Sewell remembered the panic in the North Division. Like an immense drove of panic-stricken sheep, the terrified mass ran and rushed and scrambled and screamed through the streets. Men who wrote about the Great Fire generally portrayed women as passive and helpless, waiting for their husbands, brothers, or some other man to save them. This seemed to go doubly for women who were wealthier. But if we look beyond the condescending references, a remarkable picture of strong and very active women emerges. Sewell might describe women as weak and delicate and accustomed to no toil or trial, but they still managed to flee with their arms full of treasures rescued from their doomed homes, and some even shouldered valises and trunks with the strength of strong men and bore and dragged them through the crowd. Or take the case of Julia Lemos. Lemos was a recent widow and the mother of 5. In addition, she was taking care of her ailing mother and her elderly father, all while holding down a job as an artist at a lithographer's shop. At the end of September, Lemos found the burden of caring for all of these dependents overwhelming, and, reluctantly and tearfully, she placed 4 of her children in the nearby half-orphan asylum. She hoped that her mother would recover quickly so that the separation would be a very short one. Lemos found the situation extremely hard emotionally. While the chores were a bit easier, she missed her children and worried about them constantly. On the weekend of the fire, Lemos went to the asylum to get her children back, but was told that it was against official policy to release them just then. Monday morning, Lemos woke to discover that the fire was heading toward their block. Her first course of action was to march to the asylum and demand that her children be turned over to her without any official mumbo-jumbo. With her children in tow, she hurried home to organize their flight. Since Lemos had little money, she went next door to her landlord's house and asked for the $12 she had given him for that month's rent. He refused to give back any money. But when she didn't leave, he offered a compromise. He would take a load of her possessions to the prairie for the rent money. Lemos agreed and got 2 large trunks packed and on the wagon, plus a mattress and a feather bed. At this point, her aged father balked at leaving the house, insisting that the fire would change direction before it got to them. Lemos paced the house, baby in her arms and 4 children following closely, all the time trying to convince her father to leave. She was looking out the door as others fled up the street when a woman hurried by with 3 children behind her. "Madam," the woman yelled sharply, "ain't you going to save those children?" This question jolted Lemos into action. After insisting her parents leave the house, she guided the group out of the city and into the empty prairie where their possessions had been left. 30 minutes after settling down for the night, wind-driven debris from the fire ignited the dry grass nearby, forcing them to abandon their things and retreat farther north. Lemos remembered feeling the heat of the flames on her back as she urged her parents and children along. They stopped a mile from the first spot and formed a tight circle. Lemos cradled her baby in her arms while her 9-year-old son, Willie, slept with his head in her lap. Suddenly, he began to cry. "Willie, Mother is here," she whispered. "Do not cry." "Yes, but Mama," he replied, probably remembering a scary passage from the scriptures. "Isn't this the last day?" Lemos looked up. In the distance, she could see the city on fire, the orange-red flames reaching toward the sky. She was about to say something comforting to Willie when she saw a church steeple sag, then topple over and disappear into the dark smoke and flames. It certainly did seem like the last day, but she was sure of one thing. Despite all sorts of opposition, she had kept her family together, and now they were truly safe. Most of those escaping either headed for the Western Division or for the open prairie. Almost 30,000 homeless people turned east and rushed toward the 230-acre Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park was a long finger of wooded land stretching up the banks of Lake Michigan. To reach it, many people had to tramp through the site of the old German and Catholic cemeteries. Though most of the graves had been relocated, those of the very poor remained. Soon the fire was nibbling at this peaceful strip, igniting the fence that ran along Clark Street, as well as trees and shrubs and the furniture brought there for safety. Not even the homes of the dead were safe, as wooden grave markers burst into flames and some marble vaults cracked under the intense heat. Frightened individuals huddled at the water's edge, while at least one group of desperate people constructed a crude raft and sailed it north. Surprisingly, there were few incidents of panic in the park despite the advancing flames. In fact, the crowd remained remarkably calm. One witness reported seeing a group of well-dressed people from a German saloon singing one tune after another, while, a few tombstones away, a small congregation of Methodists held a prayer meeting. The great fire would have burned until it ran out of city, then continued its hungry march across the prairie. Nothing the firemen or citizens of Chicago did seemed to stop the fire's insatiable quest for fuel. Then, around 11 o'clock, something happened that would later be called a miracle. Mixed in with the swirling smoke and falling embers, people felt a cool, damp substance on their cheeks. After several moments of shock and disbelief, they began shouting to each other with joy. What they were feeling was drizzle. As the hours crept by, the drizzle intensified. And by 3 in the morning, a steady rain was coming down. The drought that had lasted weeks and made Chicago as dry as kindling had finally broken. Miles to the south and well away from the fire, Horace White peered from his cottage window. There was no sleep for us until we heard the welcome sound of rain against our windows. How our hearts did rise in thankfulness to heaven for rain. Even those exposed to the rain in Lincoln Park must have rejoiced. The rain was chilly and uncomfortable, but it soaked the leaves and shrubs and grass and halted the fire. One of the newly homeless was Mary Fales, who captured the general feeling of relief and salvation when she wrote, "I never felt so grateful in my life as to hear the rain pour down at 3 o'clock this morning. That stopped the fire." The fire's rapid spread had been halted, but pockets of fire would burn in places all through the night and for days afterward. Contained at last, the fires could be dealt with real effect. But a new kind of drama was just beginning. Nearly 100,000 people were now homeless. Many had been separated from loved ones during the fire and now had the daunting task of searching through a ruined city for them. One of these people was Claire Innes. After escaping the alley, she went along any street that was not burning, hoping to see someone familiar. Finally, I was too tired to take another step and gave up. I sat next to a pile of building stones and fell asleep. I woke only once and felt a light rain on my face and almost shouted I was so happy. There were no fires near and no lights of any kind, so it was very dark. Someone was moving down the street, a man with a bundle who was using a stick to push aside wood and bricks. He put something, I could not see it, in the bundle and then continued searching the debris. The stones I was leaning on were still warm, but I began shivering and hoped the sun would appear again soon.